Master Bildwissengestaltung at the Helmholtz Center of the Humboldt University and with the Conservation and Scientific Research Department of the Rijksmuseum, is devoted to the question of conserving active matter. We began this a year ago with the kickoff conference right here in this room. And then it has broken down, just to give you an overview of the project, into 4 working groups. One on indigenous ontologies of activity, which is led by Aaron Glass. A second on history and active matter, which is led by my colleague Ittai Weinryb and myself. A third on active matter and materials, led by Jennifer Moss. And the fourth, active matter and philosophy, led by Ivan Gaskell. And each of these working groups has had a semester to plan an event of the sort that you're about to experience unfolding here over the next 36 hours. And then it's gone on to the next group. So each group gets a semester, that's 2 years. And then there'll be a course sequence where the 4 working groups and the professors leading them will plan a course together on the model of Bard's Focus Project, leading into an exhibition that will be held here in the spring of 2022. So that's the overall project that we're engaged with. The question of active matter and history and its importance for conservation is the one we're going to embark upon today. And Ittai and I will each take a few minutes right at the beginning of the day to give our own presentations on, in a sense, what it's about. And then we will unfold with the panels, each presentation of around 25 minutes, and then a question and answer period from the table here. So in the first 5 years of Cultures of Conservation, I learned that conservation is a kind of archaeology. What I mean by this is that conservation peels back layers of time in much the same way that an archaeologist might excavate through time by going through space. But if conservation is a form of archaeology, and if archaeology is a way of doing history through things, then conservation is a way of doing history. That's the first thing I learned, and as a historian, that made me quite excited. But there's a further turn of the screw, and that is that if conservation knowledge is a kind of historical knowledge, then might it also be true that history is a kind of conservation? Historians don't usually think that way. But it's possible, and this is from the other side of history, from the thinking about antiquarianism, it's possible to think about a way of studying the past that is, in fact, not just related to conservation, but in fact animated by the desire to conserve, right? So if we think about antiquarianism as a possible form of studying the past in which conservation is essential, this is very different from the way we think about history and the way we've all been trained, if we're historians, the Ranke-Droysen history as imagining the past as it really was, as a form of reenactment, as a form of interpretation. But it's much closer, in fact, to what Johan Huizinga talked about in his vision of cultural history as a kind of morphology, the way in which the focus on parts of the past connected presents a picture of it. And here we do have a vision in which the attention to individual detail, a kind of lavishing of attention on it, is crucial. Now, to why history is connected to active matter. We began last spring with indigenous ontologies, through which, in a way, we realized that the assumption that matter is active, the discovery that matter is active, which animates lots of scholarship in this sphere right now, is in fact a very narrow-minded one. Narrow-minded temporally and narrow-minded, as it turns out, geographically as well. So indigenous ontologies of matter opened up our eyes to the reality that it's quite normal to consider matter as active. And then, as we will turn spatially today to Buddhism as a kind of stand-in, we'll see that, in fact, in large parts of the world, it's always been normative to imagine matter as active as well. So then the question is Europe distinct in having a tradition in which it is a discovery circa 2000 to say that matter is active? And in fact, once you think that way, then you can submit this to historical analysis. And lo and behold, once upon a time, in the area that we now call Europe, it was quite normal also to think of matter as active. And that's really where we begin, again, with Nietzsche, who understands the pre-Platonic philosophers doing just this thing, and singling out Anaximander, this fragment of Anaximander, which Heidegger thought was the beginning of Western philosophy and wrote about it quite extensively, where there is fundamentally this notion of becoming at its center, and also the recognition that in the world of becoming there is perishing, there is the perception of loss, there is the feeling that loss is an injustice. Perhaps we might even say with Anaximander that it is he who discovers the notion of inherent vice, only that it functions at the level of existence altogether. So for Nietzsche, thinking about Anaximander, all of this is on the table. The idea that everything is becoming, and yet becoming often seems to us as an injustice, and an injustice that is part of the regime of time itself. And Nietzsche takes this in the direction of ethics. What does it mean that the world all around us is a sum of unexpiated injustices? But thinking about this in conservation terms, it raises some fundamental questions. If the world is becoming, then things will perish, will deteriorate. But if that becoming is seen as injustice, then do we have the right or even the obligation to try and arrest that change, to stabilize the objects? And does that stabilization actually function as a kind of redemption, redeeming perishing from injustice? These are big questions, but I just want to put them out there. And in a way, restoring, bringing back this Ionian perspective on philosophy is a way of encapsulating, in some sense, the vision of European thought in which, and this is in fact the way the working group proceeded, encapsulating European thought in which there is passivity as the norm, activity as the discovery, and the history of philosophy then becomes a kind of dualistic struggle. So in a way, this whole day is structured around the notion of the dualisms that have arisen, and in fact the question of whether they are in fact legitimate, whether in fact activity is the norm, whether there always was notions of activity and matter, whether it's magic or Kabbalah, but they were seen as marginal. The question of the 17th century, which we'll engage with quite directly in a panel, and then the return to notions of activity in the 20th century, something else we'll come back to, even before the rediscovery of active matter as a topos in the 21st century. So the third point with which I will end, to really move to a kind of post-Einsteinian thinking about time, in the world, in the quantum world, where there is only movement and only instability and only probability, there is the question of becoming. Everything remains becoming, but there's also a question which is very important for all of us here and for all of those people who think about objects, and that is, in the quantum world, there are no things. There are only events. And so to talk about a thing is just to talk about an event of a certain duration, which means the real question from our perspective, and it's a question that affects historians of objects and philosophers of objects and conservators of objects, is there a quantum theory of objects? Now that takes us very far afield, even to a more complicated terrain than this day might have seemed like, but it's one that I think we need to think about. And then just some takeaways at the end. For conservators, in this kind of quantum world, conservators become the new historians, because if history is about change over time and objects are change over time, then those who study objects are in fact their historians. But historians also become scientists because they can predict the future, as conservators can. Objects will deteriorate in certain ways. And for historians, the takeaway is also clear, and that is that Braudel was wrong. There's nothing shameful about events. In fact, events are everything. But he was also right in that everything is only about registers of time, and that's the way we should think of things. Even planets, plants, pots, political parties, all of them are time signatures, and it's really just a question of how long is the longue durée that you are thinking of. And so to wrap it up, when Nietzsche talked about his real goal, he talked about it as a Zukunftsphilologie, a philology of the future, and maybe thinking about conserving active matter from the point of view of history leads us to something else, Zukunftshistorie, a new way of thinking about history or the history of the future. Thank you.
Right. So I'm going to say a few words as well, and we're going to start the day as they load the PowerPoint. So as they load the PowerPoint, I would just say that we would like to thank Laura Minsky and our who organized all of this and her team, as well as our members of the steering committee that Peter already mentioned. There's an exhibition in 18 West 86th Street that you're welcome to visit at lunch break, and the exhibition is called Agents of Faith and deals with votive offerings, and I will give a tour of the exhibition tonight at 6:15 p.m. So those of you who want to be part of the tour, please join us at 18 West at 6:15 this evening after the day ends. On May 30, 1832, only a few days before his death, Jeremy Bentham, the founder of modern philosophical utilitarianism, has asked his friend Dr. Thomas Smith to perform a dissection of his remains in order to prepare an outer icon that will be made of from his own remains and will be encased in a glass box. So, as the will indicates, if it should happen that my personal friends and other disciples should be disposed to meet together on some day or days of the year for the purpose of commemorating the founder of the greatest happiness system of morals and legislation, my executor will, from time to time, cause to be conveyed the room in which they meet. The said box or case with the contents therein to be stationed in such part of the room as to the assembled company shall seem meet. Dr. Smith started the project, removing the internal organs of Bentham's body and covering the skeleton with wax and thereafter with clothing. When it came to the moment when he attempted to preserve the head of Bentham, Dr. Smith used technique practiced in Maori, New Zealand, in which an air pump placed underneath the head drew the fluids of the head, and the use of sulfuric acid was brought into play in order to preserve, so to speak, the facial expressions of Mr. Bentham. The technique did not work, as you can see, and the result left the head in very little physical expression. The head therefore had to be replaced with a wax head. The outer icon of Bentham sits till this very day in the glass cabinet. Drawing upon the will, Smith developed that the outer icon is traditionally rolled into the UCL Senate meetings and is present without voting. And you can see the state of British academia. Other myths develops around the body of the deceased philosopher, making his presence something that equals to that of a medieval saintly relic. Fast track to 2017, when the figure of Bentham was brought to the exhibition Like Life at the Met Breuer, where it stood side by side with a contemporary sculpture, where the sculptor, Mark Quinn, made a portrait of himself with his own blood immersed in frozen silicon. The work of art is breathed life through the insertion of the artist's own blood into an outer icon, while Bentham is preserved through a ritualistic practice around the remains of what is regarded as a self-portrait. The queen's self-portrait is rendered through blood and silicon made in the likeness, while Bentham's is rendered through his own physical body, material remains, will, and ritual. The blood activates Queen's portrait, while Bentham's activity is generated through the ritualistic practice enacted around the bone and the wax corpse, and of course the glass case. Both these objects made for specific settings, whether the art world, as we would like to call it, or relic-like commemoration of the dead, are made with conservation demands at hand that are culturally specific and historically entangled within a definitive requirements demanded by time and place of making, as well as ritual rather than what we could imagine to be scientific or historically divorced practice. Medieval artifacts, as the image in the poster for this conference, and early modern, and those of you who knows a little bit about medieval art know that this is not a medieval crucifix, it's actually an early modern one, probably 16th century, if not later, which thought to embody in this way or the other the presence of deities, allude to the fact that there was a time in Western medieval Europe or Western early modern Europe in which conservation practices regarding these artifacts were not set in cold conservation labs, but rather practiced in situ by priests and other religious authorities themselves. Such are inscriptions found on medieval bronze doors, for example, where the artist or the bronze caster begs the priest to clean the doors regularly so they gleam in the sun. Cleaning meant, of course, covering the doors with oil or wax to prevent corrosion and other activities that will ruin the work of bronze. How this was done and in what manner old medieval practices were conserving such artifacts as bronze doors or crucifixes, and more important, what was the ritualistic practice surrounding it, and to what extent that part of the ritual that was lost because of conservation was lost because of conservation practices in labs today. Of that, we do not know. What was lost because of that rise of conservation science, and what part of active matter which was made of part of these active artifacts, either as in material religious significance, was lost as part of this transition into, so to speak, the modern world. As a white man working on Western medieval art, I was surprised to see in modern day conservation labs, such as that of the Freer Sackler, traditional tables used for the conservation of Japanese painting, and this is the lower ones on the right, and lacquer table on the left, specially flown from Shanghai, that is used for the conservation of Chinese painting. I am sure that there's a lot of many reasonable explanations as to why this is still done, and both scientifically and significantly. But for me, it mainly reminded me of what we have lost in the European practices of conservation of cultural artifacts. What in a way was lost for the sake of what we would like to call a science. And of course, we cannot end a proper introduction to an event like this without mentioning a dead European man. In 1903, Alois Riegel, one of our Teutonic fathers of our fields, of our various fields, published two articles. The first, known as The Modern Cult of Monuments, Its Essence and Its Development, dealt with different commemorative and symbolic values of the public monument. Here, Riegel famously distinguished between age value, commemorative value, use value, and the relative art value of the public monument. At the same year, that is 1903, he published an essay called Questions on the Restoration of Wall Painting, where instead of focusing on the value of the object itself, he focused on the potential pressure groups involved in the restoration, or as he put it, the three groups of wall painting beholders. And the three groups are the art historians, the radicals, and the traditionalists. The art historians were interested in the wall painting as a document of the past. The radicals were the present-day art lovers who were interested in the aesthetic qualities of the painting and its formalistic merits. And the third group was made of those who saw the painting a commemorative or spiritual value of something that has to be preserved. The clergy, as you can guess, and the religious followers of that clergy, obviously belong to the last group, that of the belong to the last group, that of wait a sec, who is the last group? Now I lost. Art historians, radicals, and the traditionals, right? So the clergy and the and the religious folks were obviously traditional and belong to the last group. Each group has its own needs, and each group saw a different form of active essence in the wall painting. For each, conserving active matter means something else. Each saw activity and its meaning as a different thing, and for each certain type of activity was thought as to be or needed to be preserved. Therefore, according to Riegel, as we can see, there are different ways in which each group or each peer pressure group has ideas about how wall painting should be preserved. And therefore, just to conclude this introduction, the two dead European men pose many questions that hopefully we will uncover today about activity, about history, about how matter is changing, and how we as historians can deal with that notion of change.